The memoirs of military leaders are always of great interest to historians and researchers, as they can shed light on important details of historical events and military operations that were not previously known. However, as Marshal Moskalenko noted, it is important to understand that the so-called after-knowledge effect is often present in memoirs. This means that the authors, relying on the information available at the time of writing the memoirs, often interpret events without taking into account that in reality they did not have all the necessary information at the time of their creation. This can lead to scandals and disagreements, as the interpretation of events in the light of modern knowledge does not always coincide with the reality of those times. One of the most famous examples of such publications was the memoirs of Marshal Chuikov, which began to be published in October magazine in 1964. These memories caused a huge resonance and became a real sensation. Chuikov argued that Berlin could have been captured as early as February 1945, which could have ended the war 3 months earlier and avoided additional casualties. This statement greatly affected Zhukov's reputation and also became the first serious challenge to the official version of events about the end of the Great Patriotic War. The publication of Chuikov's memoirs caused a storm of discussion and controversy. The Western media immediately accused the Soviet Union of deliberately delaying the end of the war, claiming that the Soviet command deliberately did not rush to attack Berlin in order to inflict as many losses on the Germans as possible. The version was especially actively disseminated in the German magazine Stern, which claimed that this was how the USSR sought the mass extermination of German troops. This accusation was especially relevant against the backdrop of the growing Cold War, and it is not surprising that it attracted the attention of Western politicians and the media. In the Soviet Union, the publication of memoirs was also not without consequences. Already in March of the same year, Zhukov sent a letter to Khrushchev in which he accused Chuikov of trying to defame his work as a front commander and a member of the Supreme Command headquarters. He also justified his tactics towards Berlin and explained why he did not consider it advisable to storm the German capital immediately. Khrushchev, although he removed Zhukov from his posts, nevertheless drew attention to his arguments, and the decision to suspend the publication of Chuikov's memoirs was made. Nevertheless, after Khrushchev's resignation, both marshals appealed to Brezhnev to allow the publication of Chuikov's memoirs. Zhukov also repeated his complaints. As a result, Brezhnev decided that the issue should be referred to the main political directorate, which in turn organized an open debate discussing the role of both marshals in making decisions on Berlin. Zhukov, however, did not attend these debates, which caused discontent among the participants. In the end, the majority of those present condemned Chuikov. Marshal Moskalenko, in turn, noted that such issues should have been raised back in 1945 and not 2 decades later. Chuikov admitted that his memoirs are not devoid of subjectivity, but remained of his opinion. He promised not to publicly criticize the decisions of the command anymore, but his position remained unchanged. The arguments put forward by the marshals are interesting and deserve attention. There is no definite answer to the question of which of them is right, since each of them expressed reasonable and logical arguments. However, there is also an opinion that the decision to suspend the offensive was made by Stalin personally for political reasons, and Zhukov was forced to follow this decision. Let's look at this in more detail based on the known facts. The Vistula Oder Offensive, which began on January 12, 1945, is one of the fastest and most successful operations of the Second World War. By the end of January 1945, it became clear that the Soviet army could achieve much greater success than had been envisaged in the original plans. On January 26th, Zhukov and Konev addressed the headquarters with a report stating that the Soviet troops had a real opportunity to capture Berlin by the end of February if they took a short pause to replenish supplies. Stalin supported this proposal and agreed to continue the operation. However, despite the successes achieved, the offensive was suspended and Berlin was captured only 3 months later, in May. Chuikov, in particular, blamed the headquarters and the front command for the fact that the offensive was not continued. In his opinion, if the supply and transportation of troops had been properly organized, the operation could have continued and Berlin would have been taken in February 1945. According to his calculations, Berlin was only 100 kilometers away, and the capture of the German capital on the move could lead to the end of the war. Zhukov, in turn, put forward counter-arguments. He pointed out that the offensive was too stretched and his flanks were vulnerable. At that time, the enemy had concentrated a strike force in Pomerania, and if it had struck the flank of the Soviet troops, the front could have been surrounded. In addition, information from the Allies reported on the movement of the SS Panzer Army towards Berlin. If the operation failed, the entire Soviet group could be surrounded, which could lead to disastrous consequences. Additionally, it is worth noting that supply problems did occur. By the time the bridgeheads on the Oder were captured, ammunition and fuel supplies were almost exhausted. In such a situation, continuing the offensive could be extremely risky. Also, in early 1945, the Germans were able to regain air supremacy, which created serious obstacles to the further advance of Soviet troops. Although the Pomeranian group did not have sufficient forces for a counterattack, at the time of the decision, this factor could not be ignored. If ignored, the consequences could be serious. According to some historians, if Berlin had been taken in February, the war could have ended faster. However, the capture of the capital of the Reich at that moment would not necessarily have led to the immediate surrender of Germany. The Wehrmacht still continued to resist in other regions, for example in northern Italy and on the Eastern Front. Therefore, the end of the war would still be a matter of time, but hardly immediately after the capture of Berlin. There is also the opinion of the British historian Alan Taylor, who believes that the offensive was suspended on Stalin's orders. By that time, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, and the capture of Berlin had become less important than further steps to strengthen the influence of the Soviet Union in Central Europe. In general, researchers agree that the capture of Berlin in February 1945 was quite possible. However, taking into account many factors, the continuation of the offensive at that moment was fraught with great risks. Even if the operation had been successful, it would not have guaranteed an immediate end to the war.